You didn't make a mistake, Daniel Whitmore said quietly, his voice cutting through the soft hum of conversation. You made a choice. The rain pressed against the tall glass windows like a steady whisper, blurring the lights of downtown Manhattan into streaks of gold and gray. And inside the restaurant, everything felt suspended in that single moment. Every fork paused midair, every glance shifting toward the young waitress standing beside table 12, her posture straight, her hands still, her expression unreadable. Emily Carter didn't answer right away. She looked at the receipt in her hand, then at the man in front of her, taking in the tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, the watch resting effortlessly on his wrist, the kind of watch people noticed without meaning to. And then she lifted her eyes to meet his. Calm, unhurried. I'll fix it, she said, her tone even, almost gentle. But it's not a choice I made. A faint smile touched Daniel's lips, not warm, not kind, but precise, like a man placing a piece on a chessboard. Isn't it? He asked. Numbers don't change themselves. Around them, the restaurant breathed again, but quieter now, like it knew something was unfolding. Emily glanced down once more at the printed total, a difference of just under $20, small enough to ignore, large enough to matter, the kind of detail most people would rush past, the kind of detail Daniel Whitmore built his reputation on. He watched her carefully, studying not just what she said, but how long she took to say it, how her fingers rested against the paper without trembling, how her shoulders didn't tighten the way most people's did when they realized who he was. Emily adjusted the receipt slightly on the table, aligning it with the edge as if the small act of order mattered. Then she spoke again. The system glitched, she said. It happens sometimes during peak hours. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the faint clink of ice shifting in his glass the only sound he made. Convenient, he replied. For you. A server passed behind her, slower than necessary, pretending not to listen, and somewhere near the bar, someone lowered their voice mid-sentence. Emily didn't turn. She didn't defend herself the way people usually did, didn't rush to fill the silence or soften the accusation. Instead, she simply stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of his words exist without reacting to them. I'll bring you a corrected bill, she said finally. No apology, no hesitation, just a statement. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in interest. This wasn't how it usually went. Most people apologized first, explained second, and only then, if they dared, suggested there might be another explanation. But she had skipped all of that. He tapped a finger lightly against the table, once, twice, measuring something invisible. Before you do, he said, his voice softer now, almost conversational. Tell me something, Emily. The way he said her name made it clear he hadn't just read it off the receipt. She paused, just for a fraction of a second. Yes, sir. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, deliberate. If I told you I knew that error didn't come from the system, he said, would you still say the same thing? The question hung in the air, heavier than before, quieter too, like the room itself was listening for her answer. Emily met his eyes again, and this time there was something different there, not fear, not defiance, but recognition, as if she understood the shape of the moment more clearly than he expected. Yes, she said, just one word. No explanation, no adjustment. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore didn't immediately respond. Daniel did not blink, but something in his expression shifted, subtle and almost imperceptible, like a calculation that no longer returned the expected result. And for a moment, he simply studied her, not as a customer studies a server, but as a man studies a variable that refuses to behave. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping insistently against the glass, and somewhere near the entrance a door opened, letting in a brief gust of cold air before closing again. But at table 12, the air felt still, contained, as if the rest of the world had stepped back. Interesting, Daniel said at last, leaning back again, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer dismissive. Most people would adjust their answer by now. Emily did not move. Most people would not ask the question that way, she replied, her voice steady, neither challenging nor submissive, simply precise. A faint flicker passed through Daniel's eyes, not irritation, not quite approval, but recognition of something unexpected. He reached for his glass, letting the ice settle again before setting it down without taking a sip. You are certain the system is at fault, he said. I am certain the number is wrong, Emily answered. She let the distinction sit between them, quiet but deliberate. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if reconsidering the angle of the conversation. And you are not curious, he asked, about why I would suggest otherwise. Emily paused, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if selecting which part of the truth mattered. Curiosity is not the same as responsibility, she said. My responsibility is to correct what is in front of me. The words landed softly, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. Daniel's gaze sharpened. And if what is in front of you is incomplete, he pressed. Emily lowered her eyes briefly to the receipt again, then placed it carefully on the table, aligning it once more with the edge, the same quiet habit, the same controlled motion. Then I correct what I can prove, she said, and I do not assume the rest. For a second, no one moved. The low murmur of the restaurant continued somewhere in the background, but it felt distant, like sound filtered through water. Daniel tapped the table once more, slower this time. You are very confident, he said. Emily shook her head slightly. No, she replied. Just careful. The distinction hung there, subtle but undeniable, and it unsettled him more than confidence would have. Confidence could be challenged. Carefulness was harder to break. Daniel leaned forward again, resting his forearms lightly against the table, his voice dropping just enough that only she could hear. What if I told you, he said, that this error did not come from the system at all? Emily did not flinch. Then I would. Ask how you know that, she answered. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no urgency, just a quiet insistence on clarity. Daniel watched her closely, searching for the smallest crack, the slightest sign of doubt, but her expression remained composed, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged. He had seen people lie before. He had seen them panic, over-explain, retreat. This was none of those things. This was something else entirely. He leaned back once more, slower now, as if recalibrating. Because, he said, after a brief pause, I created it. The words were simple, almost casual, but they shifted the entire shape of the moment. Around them, nothing changed, no one reacted, no sound broke the surface, and yet everything felt different. Emily's eyes held his for a fraction longer this time, not in surprise, but in understanding, as if a piece had just clicked into place. Then it is not an error, she said quietly. It is a test. Daniel did not deny it. He simply watched her, waiting to see if this was the moment she adjusted, the moment she bent, the moment she chose differently. But Emily only reached for the receipt again, lifted it slightly, and then set it back down. Then the number is still wrong, she said. And this time, Daniel Whitmore did not have an immediate answer. Daniel's fingers stilled against the table, the faint rhythm he had maintained now gone, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before, and for the first time that evening, the control he was known for did not vanish, but shifted, as if something deeper had been touched without warning. He studied her again, not with the casual dominance of a man used to being obeyed, but with a sharper focus, searching for the structure behind her calm, the reason she did not bend even when the rules had changed. You understand what this is, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. Emily did not nod. She did not confirm. She simply held his gaze, steady, unwavering, as if the label did not matter as much as the truth itself. Then why not respond accordingly? He continued, leaning forward slightly. If you know it is a test, why not treat it like one? The question lingered, deliberate, almost inviting her to step into a different role, one that most people would accept without hesitation. Emily's hand rested lightly against the edge of the table, her fingers relaxed, her posture unchanged. Because that would change the answer, she said. Simple, direct. Daniel's eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in recognition of the implication. And you believe the answer should not change, he pressed. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering the phrasing more than the challenge. I believe the answer should not depend on who is asking, she replied. The words settled between them with a quiet finality, and something in Daniel's expression shifted again, more noticeable this time, like a realization he had not expected to arrive so soon. Around them, a server dropped a fork somewhere near the kitchen, the sound sharp and brief, quickly absorbed back into the low murmur of the room, But at table 12, the stillness returned almost immediately. Daniel leaned back once more, slower now, his gaze no longer fixed on the receipt, but entirely on her. "Do you know how many people I have asked questions like this?" he said, not really expecting an answer. Emily did not respond. "Hundreds," he continued, his voice carrying a quiet weight. "Employees, partners, executives, people with far more at stake than a dinner bill." He paused, letting that sink in, then added, "They all adjust eventually." Emily's expression did not change. "Adjusting is easy," she said. "It just depends on what you are willing to lose." Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a faint exhale that carried something close to disbelief. "And what do you think you would lose?" he asked, "over something this small?" Emily glanced down at the receipt again, then back at him, her eyes calm, but now with a trace of something deeper, something that had not been there before. "It is never just this small," she said. The answer was quiet, almost reflective, but it landed with more force than anything she had said so far. Daniel watched her closely, and for a brief moment, the restaurant around them seemed to fade. Completely, leaving only the space between them, the question he had designed, and the answer he had not anticipated. He leaned forward again, this time without the calculated precision from before, as if the movement came before the strategy. "You speak like someone who has seen the cost already," he said. Emily did not look away. "I have," she replied. No explanation followed. No story offered. Just the statement, complete on its own. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in something closer to recognition, as if a distant memory had been stirred, something unresolved, something he had chosen not to revisit. He glanced briefly at the receipt, then back at her, and for the first time, the question in his eyes was not about the answer she would give, but about the truth behind it. "Then tell me," he said, his voice lower now, almost careful, "what exactly do you think I am testing here?" Emily looked at him for a long moment, not rushing, not hesitating, simply deciding, and when she spoke, her voice was as steady as ever. "Not integrity," she said. "Control." And this time, Daniel Whitmore did not look away first. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that silence was different from the others, heavier, less controlled, as if her last word had not just answered his question but redirected it entirely, and for a brief moment, the certainty he carried into every room seemed to hesitate. He leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, but now there was something else beneath the surface, something less certain, less rehearsed. "Control," he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of the word in his own voice. Emily did not correct him. She did not soften it either. She simply waited, allowing the meaning to settle where it needed to. The rain outside softened for a moment, the steady tapping easing into a quieter rhythm, and in that brief lull, the faint sound of a piano track filtered through the restaurant, low and distant, almost unnoticed by everyone except the two of them. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting just slightly to the receipt before returning to her. "You think I need to control the outcome," he said. It was not quite a question. Emily tilted her head a fraction, considering the phrasing again, the same careful habit that had followed every word she had chosen. "I think you already decided the outcome," she replied. The distinction landed cleanly. Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, the smallest visible crack in the composed image he carried so effortlessly. "And what outcome would that be?" he asked, his voice steady again, but now carrying something sharper beneath it. Emily glanced briefly at the table, then back at him, her eyes steady, unflinching. "That I would adjust," she said. "That eventually I would say what you expected to hear." The words were not accusatory. They were observational. That made them harder to dismiss. Daniel's fingers moved again, but this time the motion was slower, less rhythmic, more deliberate, as if he was grounding himself in something familiar. "And you did not," he said. Emily shook her head once. No, the simplicity of it lingered. No explanation, no elaboration, just the absence of compliance. Daniel let out a faint breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. "Do you know what usually happens next?" he asked. Emily did not answer. She did not need to. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering again, the conversation narrowing once more to just the two of them. "I reveal the test," he said. "I explain the setup, the intention, the lesson." He paused, watching her reaction, waiting for even the smallest shift. There was none. And then, he continued, I reward the person who passed. The word reward hung in the air, subtle, but unmistakable. Around them, a server passed with a tray of glasses, the faint clink of glass against glass briefly filling the space before fading again. Emily's gaze did not move. That is generous, she said softly. The tone carried no admiration, only acknowledgement. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. You do not sound impressed, he said. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and this time, there was something else in her expression, not defiance, not judgment, but clarity, as if she had already seen this moment before it happened. Because that is still part of the test, she replied. The words landed quietly, but they shifted something again, something deeper than before. Daniel did not speak. He simply watched her, waiting. Emily continued, her voice steady, calm, unhurried. If I accept the reward, she said, then the answer becomes about what I gain. She paused, just long enough for the thought to settle. Not about what is true. The room felt still again, the background noise fading into something distant, almost irrelevant. Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that something had reached him, something he had not accounted for. He leaned back slowly, his gaze no longer sharp, but thoughtful, as if recalculating something far beyond a dinner bill. So you would refuse it, he said. Emily did not hesitate. Yes. No condition. No exception. Just the answer. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and this time, there was no immediate response, no follow-up question, no controlled reaction, only a quiet, unfamiliar pause. And for the first time since the conversation began, it was not clear who was leading it anymore. Daniel did not reach for his wallet, did not signal for the check, did not move in any of the predictable ways that usually followed a finished test, and that alone shifted the balance of the moment into something quieter, something less defined, as if the script he had relied on no longer applied. He sat there, still, his gaze resting on the receipt but not quite seeing it, his mind clearly somewhere else, recalculating, reconsidering, and for the first time that evening, not entirely in control of where the conversation would go next. Emily did not fill the silence. She did not step away either. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, her posture unchanged, as if she understood that this part mattered just as much as anything that had already been said. The faint sound of rain returned, soft at first, then gradually stronger, tapping against the glass in a rhythm that felt almost intentional, like a quiet reminder that time was still moving even if the moment had slowed. Daniel finally looked up, his expression no longer sharp, no longer testing, but searching. You said it is. Never just this small, he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more direct. Emily nodded once, a subtle motion. It is not, she replied. Daniel studied her for a second longer, then leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the table, fingers relaxed now, no longer tapping. Explain that, he said. It was not a command. It was something closer to a request. Emily glanced briefly toward the window, the blurred lights beyond the glass, then back at him, as if deciding how much to say, how much mattered in this moment. Small decisions repeat, she said. They build patterns. Her voice remained calm, measured, but there was something deeper underneath it now, something that carried weight beyond the words themselves. And patterns become habits, she continued. And habits, she paused, just long enough for him to follow the thought. They become who you are. The sentence settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and Daniel's expression shifted again, more noticeably this time, as if the simplicity of it made it harder to argue with. He looked down at the receipt again, then back at her, and for a brief moment, something like recognition passed through his eyes, not of her, but of the idea itself. So you think this, he said, gesturing lightly toward the paper, is not about $20. Emily shook her head slightly. No, she said. It never was. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension that had defined his posture beginning to ease in a way that felt unfamiliar, even to him. And what do you think it is about? He asked. The question was quieter now, less guarded, as if he was no longer testing her answer, but trying to understand it. Emily held his gaze, steady, grounded. It is about whether you believe truth needs pressure to exist, she said. The words landed differently than anything before, softer in tone, but deeper in impact. And for a moment, Daniel did not respond at all. The restaurant continued around them, a server laughing quietly near the bar, the soft clink of dishes being cleared, but at table 12, everything felt distant, secondary, as if the conversation had created its own space. Daniel leaned forward slightly, not in challenge this time, but in focus. "And what do you believe?" he asked. Emily did not hesitate. "I believe truth exists whether you test it or not," she said. No emphasis, no flourish, just the statement, complete and unshaken. Daniel's gaze lingered on her, longer now, as if searching for something that was no longer there, no longer hidden, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the edge that had defined him at the beginning of the night began to fade. He glanced down at the receipt one last time, then pushed it gently across the table, not as part of a test, not as a move in a game, but as something simpler, something real. "Then fix it," he said quietly. And this time, there was no test behind the words. Emily picked up the receipt without a word, her fingers steady, her movements the same as before, precise and unhurried. But something in the air had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable, as if the space between them no longer carried the tension of a test, but the quiet weight of something acknowledged. She turned slightly, taking a step back from the table, not as an escape, not as a retreat, but simply to do what needed to be done, and for a brief moment, Daniel watched her in silence, his eyes following the small, controlled movements that no longer felt ordinary. Around them, the restaurant resumed its rhythm, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking softly, a server passing with a tray balanced effortlessly, and yet none of it seemed to reach him in the same way it had before. Emily walked toward the terminal station near the service counter, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly against her face as she entered the correction, her posture unchanged, her focus complete, and for the first time that evening, there was no one watching her hands, no one waiting for a mistake, only the quiet process of making something right. Daniel remained at the table, his gaze shifting briefly to the window, where the rain continued its steady fall, tracing lines down the glass that blurred the city beyond into something softer, less defined, and he found himself noticing details he usually ignored, the reflection of light in the water, the muted movement of headlights passing below, the way everything continued without pause. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, his hand resting against the table without the restless tapping that had defined him earlier, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar settled in, not discomfort, not frustration, but a kind of clarity that did not arrive with force, only with quiet persistence. When Emily returned, she placed the updated receipt in front of him, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table just as she had before, her movements consistent, unchanged by anything that had happened between them. "It is corrected," she said. No emphasis, no expectation, just the statement. Daniel looked down at the new total, the numbers now precise, the small discrepancy gone, and for a moment, he did not reach for it. Instead, he looked back at her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer calculating, but thoughtful, as if he was still processing something that had not fully settled. "You knew I would not stop," he said quietly. Emily did not deny it. "Yes," she replied. Daniel's eyes lingered on her, searching again, but not for weakness this time, not for inconsistency, but for understanding. "And you stayed anyway," he continued. Emily's gaze remained steady. "It was not about staying," she said. "It was about answering the same way." The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, and Daniel felt it, the difference between endurance and consistency, between reacting and remaining unchanged. He nodded once, almost to himself, then reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet with a motion that felt slower than usual, less automatic. And as he placed a card on the table, there was no performance in it, no display, only the simple act of closing the interaction. Emily picked up the card, her expression neutral, professional, and turned to process the payment without hesitation. When she returned again, placing the receipt folder in front of him, Daniel opened it, signed where required, and paused for a brief second before setting the pen down. The tip he left was generous, more than the corrected bill, more than necessary, but when Emily glanced at it, her expression did not change. She did not react. She simply closed the folder, and placed it back on the table. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and this time, there was no test behind his gaze, no question waiting to be asked, only a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. "No," he said, his voice just as soft. "Thank you." And for the first time that night, the words were not part of any design. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer after she stepped away, his hand resting lightly against the signed receipt, not moving, not reaching for anything else, as if leaving immediately would undo something that had just begun to settle. Around him, the restaurant returned fully to its rhythm, conversations rising again, laughter breaking softly near the bar, the quiet hum of a place that never paused for any single moment, no matter how significant it felt to the ones inside it. He glanced once more at the rain outside, now lighter, the streaks on the glass thinner, the city beyond beginning to sharpen again, and slowly he stood, adjusting his jacket with a movement that felt familiar, practiced, yet somehow less automatic than before. As he turned toward the exit, his steps were measured, steady, but his attention lingered behind him, drawn not by habit, but by something he could not quite name. Emily was already at another table, her posture the same, her voice calm as she spoke to a couple seated near the window, explaining a menu item with quiet clarity, her focus entirely on them, as if nothing unusual had happened just minutes before. Daniel paused, just briefly, watching from a distance, noticing how easily she returned to the ordinary, how seamlessly she moved from one moment to the next without carrying the weight of the previous one. Most people would have held on to it, replayed it, adjusted their tone, their posture, their sense of self. She did none of that. She simply continued. He turned again and walked toward the door, the soft sound of his shoes against the floor barely noticeable, and as he stepped outside, the cool air met him immediately, crisp and clean after the warmth inside. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, barely visible, settling lightly against the pavement, and the city moved around him in its usual way, taxis passing, headlights reflecting off wet streets, people walking quickly beneath umbrellas, each absorbed in their own direction. Daniel stood there for a moment, not moving, his gaze unfocused, his thoughts quieter than they had been in a long time, not racing ahead, not calculating outcomes, just present. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up instantly, notifications waiting, messages stacked, reminders of everything that usually demanded his attention, and yet, for the first time in a while, none of it felt urgent. His thumb hovered over the screen, then stilled, and instead of opening anything, he lowered the phone again, slipping it back into his pocket without unlocking it. Behind him, through the glass, he could still see the restaurant, the warm lights, the movement, and somewhere inside, Emily moving between tables, unnoticed by most, exactly as she had been before he arrived. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing slightly, and began to walk, not toward his car immediately, but down the sidewalk, his pace unhurried, his mind returning not to the test he had set, but to the answer he had received. The simplicity of it stayed with him, not as a challenge, not as something to solve, but as something that did not need solving. A few steps later, he stopped again, almost without thinking, and turned his head slightly, looking back once more at the building behind him. The sign above the entrance glowed softly in the night, unremarkable, easy to pass without notice, just like the person inside it. He stood there for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to himself, as if acknowledging something he had not fully understood before, and then he turned forward again and continued walking, the quiet realization following him into the city, steady, unchanged, and impossible to ignore. The night moved on, but something in Daniel did not return to its usual pace, and by the time he reached the corner where his car waited, he did not get in immediately, instead standing beneath the dim glow of a streetlight, watching the thin mist drift through the air as if time itself had softened. His driver stepped out quietly, opening the rear door with practiced precision, but Daniel did not move right away. 5 minutes, he said, his voice calm, almost absent, and the driver nodded without question, stepping back. Daniel turned slightly, his gaze drifting down the street, not searching for anything specific, yet not ready to leave either, as if the answer he had received inside had followed him out, refusing to stay behind. Across the glass behind him, the restaurant still glowed, steady, unchanged, and through it, he could see fragments of movement, shadows passing, figures shifting, a world continuing exactly as it had before he entered it. Emily was somewhere inside that rhythm, unseen from this distance, just another presence in a place full of them. And yet, she was the only one who had remained unchanged when everything else had been designed to shift. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible for a moment in the cool air, and reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting his face faintly as he opened a contact list he rarely used for anything personal. His thumb hovered, scrolling once, then stopping, not on a name, but on an empty space, as if he was searching for something that did not exist in the form he expected. He locked the screen again. The phone disappeared back into his pocket. He looked up, his eyes settling once more on the restaurant behind him, and this time, the thought came clearer, sharper, not as a question, but as a realization. He had tested hundreds of people. He had built systems around it, refined the approach, measured the results, turned human behavior into predictable patterns, and for years, it had worked exactly the way he expected. People adjusted. People adapted. People chose outcomes over truth. But tonight had not followed that pattern. Not because the test failed, but because it had never been accepted as a test to begin with. That difference stayed with him, quiet but undeniable. He stepped forward slightly, his gaze narrowing just enough to focus again through the glass, and for a brief second, he caught a glimpse of her, moving between tables, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, as if she had already moved past the moment that had stayed with him. No performance, no reflection, just continuation. Daniel shook his head once, almost to himself, a faint motion, not of disbelief, but of recognition, and something inside him settled further, not resolved, not complete, but shifted in a way that could not be reversed. She did not pass, he said quietly, the words barely audible even to himself. He paused, then added, she refused to play. The distinction mattered more than anything else. The driver glanced over briefly, unsure if the words were meant for him, but said nothing. Daniel straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket again, the familiar motion returning, but now carrying a different weight, less about appearance, more about presence. He took one last look at the restaurant, the warm light, the steady movement, the place where control had not worked the way he expected, and then he turned away, stepping toward the car at last. As he slid into the seat, the door closing softly behind him, the city resumed its usual motion around him, the car pulling into the flow of traffic, headlights merging into lines of light stretching down the avenue. But inside, the quiet remained, steady, unchanged, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore did not reach for his phone, did not review his schedule, did not plan his next move. He simply sat there, looking ahead, while the answer he had not expected continued to unfold in silence. The car moved steadily through the city, the rhythm of traffic blending into a quiet, continuous motion, and Daniel sat without speaking, his gaze fixed ahead but unfocused, as if the streets in front of him were no longer the thing he was trying to see. Buildings passed, lights shifted, reflections stretched across the glass, but none of it held his attention the way it normally would, because something else had taken its place, something quieter, something that did not demand to be solved. He rested his hand against the seat. Beside him, fingers relaxed, the absence of movement more noticeable now than any action, and for a long moment, he allowed the silence to remain untouched. Then, slowly, almost without thinking, he spoke. Turn around. The driver glanced briefly in the mirror, surprised, but nodded immediately, signaling and guiding the car smoothly into a wide turn at the next intersection. No questions. No hesitation. The city adjusted around them, and within a minute, they were heading back in the direction they had just left. Daniel did not explain. He did not need to. The decision had already formed, not from impulse, but from something that had been building quietly since the moment he stepped out into the rain. When the restaurant came back into view, its warm light still steady against the darker street, the car slowed, pulling gently to the curb once more. This time, Daniel did not wait. He opened the door himself, stepping out before the driver could move, the cool air meeting him again, familiar now, grounding. Inside, nothing had changed. The same conversations, the same quiet rhythm, The same steady movement of people who did not know anything had shifted at all. Emily was at the same section, clearing a table, her motions consistent, efficient, her attention fully present in the task in front of her. She did not look up when he entered. Not immediately. Daniel walked toward her, his steps measured, but without the calculated precision from before, and when he reached the edge of the table she was clearing, he stopped, not interrupting, not asserting, simply waiting. It was a small thing, but it was not something he usually did. Emily finished placing the last glass on her tray, adjusted it slightly so it would not shift, then turned, and only then did she see him standing there. There was no surprise in her expression, no curiosity, just recognition. "Sir," she said, her voice calm, the same as before. Daniel held her gaze for a moment, longer than necessary, as if confirming something that did not need confirmation anymore. "Emily," he replied. He did not use her last name. He did not use a title, just her name. It landed differently this time. She waited, not prompting, not filling the space, just allowing him to speak when he chose to. He glanced briefly at the table she had just cleared, then back at her. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, direct, and for a moment, they seemed almost out of place coming from him, not because they were dramatic, but because they were not part of any structure, any test, any expectation. Emily did not react immediately. She studied him for a second, not with skepticism, not with surprise, but with the same careful attention she had given every word that night. "About the bill," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "About the way I ask questions." The distinction mattered. It settled between them with a quiet weight that did not need to be explained. Emily's expression softened, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something that acknowledged the shift without needing to highlight it. "Questions are not the problem," she said. "What you expect from the answers is." Daniel let out a slow breath, a faint nod following, not as agreement alone, but as recognition of something he had not considered before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant continued around them, unchanged, unaware, and in that stillness, the difference between them was no longer defined by position, by wealth, or by role, but by something simpler, something harder to measure. Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, not placing it on the table this time, but holding it for a brief second before extending it toward her. "If you ever want something different," he said, his voice steady, without pressure, without expectation, "call me." Emily looked at the card, then back at him, her expression thoughtful, but not swayed. She took it, not quickly, not reluctantly, just as it was offered. "If I need to," she said. The words were calm, measured, and complete. Daniel nodded once, accepting that answer without trying to shape it, without trying to turn it into something else, and after a brief pause, he stepped back, giving her space again, the same way he had not done at the beginning of the night. As he turned to leave, there was no hesitation.